My name is Marie Pesch. I'm a student in the second cohort of the Political Analytics program here at Columbia, and I've been given the honor of introducing our last panel of the day, Where Did All That Money Go? Analytics and Billion-Dollar Campaign Decisions. To introduce our panelists, first we have Christina Coloroso. She's the Executive Director of the Analyst Institute. Next, Next, we have Erika Fowler. She's a professor of government at Wesleyan University and co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project. Next, we have Stephen McAlpine. Stephen is the founder and CEO of INTRVL. And then last but not least, we have our wonderful moderator, Eunji Kim. Dr. Kim is an assistant professor of political science here at Columbia University. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Dr. Kim.
All right. Is this working? It is working. Okay. So welcome to our panel. So today's session will explore how campaign decisions in 2024 were guided or misguided by data, analytics, and money. So the last time I checked, it is estimated that donors spent around $4.7 billion over the course of the 2024 election season. And that's a record-breaking investment that carries significant implications for democracy, voter engagements, and political strategy. So we're hoping that today we'll unpack how all that money, what happened to all that money, and how effectively it was spent, and what role data analytics played in influencing these billion-dollar decision-makings. So each panelist will kick off the session by presenting a single powerful slide that captures what they believe to be a critical insight into the use of data analytics during the 2024 election. So we'll get started with Christina first.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Coloroso. I'm the Executive Director of the Analyst Institute. And I know we have lots of friends at the Analyst Institute, lots of Analyst Group members in the room here, which is fantastic. But for those who are not familiar with what we do, we are the central research sharing hub for the collective left. And so we partner with organizations who run direct voter contact strategies and tactics to help them assess the impact of their programs, and then based on what they learn, to maximize the impact of their programs over time. And then we also share those findings back with our network of organizations across the country so that we're all getting stronger in running our programs together at every level of ballot and cycle after election cycle. I wanted to help situate today's conversation about the multiple $1 billion that were spent in 2024 with a teeny tiny excerpt from one product we produce at Analyst Institute called our meta-analysis. And again, for those who don't know, a meta-analysis is when we combine together the results of, in this case, hundreds and hundreds, almost sometimes thousands of individual studies or randomized controlled trials across lots of different election years, lots of different contexts, types of programs. We're combining all of that data together into one data set so that we can look for patterns and trends in program performance that go beyond what we can see when we look at just one study of a program at a time. So this particular meta-analysis looks at GOTV, or voter mobilization programs, spanning more than a decade. And again, lots of different types of programs, lots of different campaigns and organizations are reflected here. And what we're doing is we're breaking out the average effects by election type. So starting with the presidential elections, but also other types of election contexts like midterms, primaries, and specials. And I'm going to zoom in for you here to the estimate for presidential elections, just again, because we're talking about 2024. And there are two things that I want to call your attention to on this chart. So the first is the overall average effect that we see for this combined set of GOTV programs, which is reflected by that kind of hashed black line that I've circled here. If you're looking very closely, you will notice that this overall average estimate is pretty small in terms of scale. It's positive, right? So it's above zero. We have high confidence in that, and that's really important to acknowledge. But what we're talking about is a fraction of a percentage point, less than a percentage point. Again, overall, across all the different programs reflected here. And you might also notice that that average for presidential general elections is smaller than the average that you might see for other election types across the chart. And there are a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of reasons why it's a lot harder to change voter behavior in the context of a presidential election than some of these quieter election environments. But I want to start here because when we talk about why so much money was spent and how this money is spent, part of the reason why is that it's really, really hard to change voter behavior and to do so in ways that actually move the needle in the critical states, districts, and with the critical kind of must-win voters that campaigns focus their programs on. So number one, it's really, really hard to do, again, especially when you're focused on your must-win states and voters. I know that's kind of a sobering note to start with, so I want to switch to something that I think is a little bit more optimistic, which is next to that overall estimate, you'll see with the individual dots, kind of vertical dots, the range of program effects, the individual program effects that go into that overall average. And this I find very encouraging because you'll notice that there are a lot of programs that beat the average, right? They're producing much larger changes in voter turnout than that overall. Now, there's also some programs that are closer to that midline, and even some programs that we've tried, really innovative things that haven't always worked as planned or maybe even produced some backlash effects in terms of voter turnout. But this is the second point I wanted to start us off with because not only are we thinking about kind of why the money was spent, how it was spent, but ideally from Analyst Institute's perspective, we'd like to see that these large-scale investments in voter contact activity are designed and executed in such ways that are research-informed, that are aligned with the best practices that we've helped develop over more than a decade, but almost 2 decades worth of time and testing. And for folks who are members of the Analyst group, again, I'm only showing you a sliver of the research here today, but on our website, there's a ton more materials that break out and analyze kind of what makes for those higher performing programs in terms of modes of contact that are used, the audiences that are being targeted, the content of the messages, and so on and so forth. And so we really love seeing those sorts of best practices reflected in especially the large-scale spending that's taking place in presidential elections. Because again, that's how we're beating the average and actually getting closer to the votes that we need to win. And then lastly, I'll just kind of wrap here by saying that part of the title of this panel is about the role of analytics in this sort of research and spending. And I will say that, again, kind of getting to data about these overall estimates, but also getting really clear on what makes for higher performing as opposed to less well-performing programs is one of the biggest kind of contributions of the field of political analytics in the last several election cycles. And so the way that it really has been integrated into the day-to-day and the large-scale decisions that are happening across campaigns and voter contact organizations of all shapes and sizes is really a change compared to the way that it was happening even just a few cycles ago. And I think it's really important, and it's a great reason why so many people are involved in the program here as well. So I'll kick us off with that.
From what? Here we go. It feels a little bit like torture to ask an academic to narrow things down to one slide, especially when I usually have a full deck that will take you through all kinds of pictures. But let me try. And I thought I might be a little bit provocative in what I showed you today, but I'm actually glad that we are following Brent, who talked about linear TV, because I'm showing you pictures from TV. And also Christina talking about small effects in the presidential race, because both of these things are true and important for the advertising world. So for those of you who may or may not know, the Wesleyan Media Project tracks in real time political advertising. We have done it for 15 years, but we have data from the Wisconsin advertising that goes back now 25 years. So we can really tell you the big picture landscape of what is happening in a campaign, especially on the television side, because that's our historical strength, but we have moved into the digital tracking as well. And of course, for those of you who know and do this, the world of political campaigning is becoming harder to track in the advertising world. So we have whole models and lots of things going on in the digital side, but I'm going to start with the television side as a framing point. So first, I think it's really important to say that in the whole 15 years that we have been tracking political advertising, everyone has predicted the downfall of television every year. it is still the case that the bulk of the dollars are going to broadcast TV. And that is because of the number of eyeballs that are there. And so thinking about that is important. The other big picture thing I wanted to say is sort of situating the 2024 presidential race specifically in contrast to what we've seen from the prior two races, but specifically in contrast to the 2016 race, since that was the last time that Trump ran against a female incumbent. We've seen three different things in those three different cycles. And I'm going to aggregate everything up to this sort of 30,000-foot view. Not that the nitty-gritty and nuance of how the ads differ, because there's lots of interesting differences to talk about, but I'm going to aggregate up because I think the big picture is also important. So as we think about the balance of TV and then digital, if you remember in 2016, Clinton out-aired Trump on television by a landslide, right? And Trump made all kinds of headlines after the election by announcing that he had spent half of his dollars on digital, right? So if you take that as your starting point and then you fast forward to 2024, we see something incredibly different. Let me, before I get there, go to 2020. So in 2020, Biden out-aired Trump, on television, but they were more competitive in the digital spaces. 2024 election is a real contrast in that there was, again, lots of interesting differences, but a much closer, in fact, I would call it stunning balance in the broadcast television space between the two campaigns. When we ran that aggregate analysis at the end, we couldn't quite believe that the numbers are as close as they are in terms of broadcast airings, like very, very close. That doesn't mean that the two campaigns did the same things, right? Harris outspent Trump, in part because she had more national airings and she spent in more expensive places and on higher rating programming. But the total number of spots aired was much closer than we've seen in the earlier cycles. You can sort of see this is a really bad way for me to look at it. The upper right, you can see on the upper part of the chart. You can see that's the volume of airings. And so we're showing you here the pro-Biden ads to start, right? Because you can look at that left side of the graph in comparison to Trump. And so that's an interesting contrast there because the Trump campaign really was not on air until Harris became the nominee. Once she does, you see they go up heavily on air, and it's those last two bars, if you follow them across, that if we add all of those airings up, they come very, very close to even. The bottom shows you the distribution in tone, right? So attack, contrast, and promote. Not surprisingly, you see that, the Harris campaign aired more positive ads. That's to be expected of a non-incumbent, right, who needs to introduce herself to the electorate. Whereas you see the Trump campaign went really heavy negative to begin full-blown attack ads and then pulled back to do more contrast spots as the time went on. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to is the lower left-hand graph. And for those of you who are aware of the work that we did, this is a graph that everyone asked us to see following the 2016 election cycle because Clinton was outpacing Trump everywhere in advertising. A lot of people were like, what happened here, right? If you look at the advertising strategy in the 2016 race, we can identify some probably obvious mistakes, right? She wasn't in Wisconsin and Michigan and even really Pennsylvania into those last couple weeks. But also, you can see that Clinton took a historically very different approach to her political advertising. And I can extend this chart all the way back to the 2000 election cycle. We just didn't do it for this particular graph. But that dark bar is the percentage of her ads that were personally focused as opposed to policy focused. Historically, political advertising generally, especially on television, tends to be pretty substantive. It's mostly policy-focused, not personal. Whereas the Clinton campaign went pretty heavily in on attacking Trump personally. And I think, unfortunately for her, the news cycle was very focused on the emails, right? It's ironic we're talking about that now. But it doubled down, right? So in her advertising, she was also giving a lot of reasons not to vote for Trump because of who he was personally, which left a real void of the policy conversation that she could have made through her ads. You see that Biden made a different choice in 2020 to bring it back closer to more policy, and you see that Harris even went even more policy-focused. It might surprise some of you to look at this graph and realize that Trump actually aired the most policy-focused campaign of any presidential candidate that we've seen since 2000. Remember, this is paid advertising, not everything else, right? His campaign was pretty professionalized, and the advertising was very substantive. There were components that talk about and that move into what we would consider a both personal and policy, but it was very substantively focused. So that matters. And then the second thing I wanted to draw so this is the television landscape. The digital landscape, by contrast, was sort of a reverse of what we had seen in the past, at least of what we can track. So I have the asterisk on there in terms of the imbalance, because digital is very hard. We have Meta and we have Google and we have Snapchat with nice full libraries that are that are accessible. To analyze them in their comprehensive nature takes a whole lot of work, which I'm happy to talk about, but we wouldn't have time now. And then you have some information from X, but there are a lot of other platforms out there for which we don't have a lot of transparency. There also are, CTV, connected TV was a big story and sort of a growing share of the advertising budget. And for a lot of these places, we have less transparency or less ability to track content. But the Harris campaign was out advertising Trump on both, especially on Meta, which includes Facebook and Instagram, but also on Google properties. They took different strategies in those two different platforms, which I'm happy to talk about if there's interest. But that, I think, is really interesting. And so if you see the arc from 2016 to 2024, what we see is almost a reversal of Trump's strategy, right? Instead of being all in on the digital side, he's sort of gone back to television. And we can talk about how that might have affected it. We have done some preliminary estimates of advertising effects, which involve some geeky political science I can talk about if there's interest. But then I just quickly, before I move on, wanted to acknowledge that the presidential race is very different than the other races that we saw, where we did see sort of traditional Democratic advantages on air. Did that matter to some, Democratic incumbents in terms of their ability to keep their seats? Potentially.
Maybe.
Okay. Sheet up a few things that I'm happy to talk about, because you said CTV, OTT. It's the one, where do we place this? Is it digital or is it broadcast? It's the thing that people buy placements for on glass on walls, a term I've heard. It's, the big screens, that could be the CTV. And so it has a lot of the benefits of, I'll show those numbers. I'm worried. I want to tee up a little bit more before I get into it, but it has a lot of the benefits of broadcast, 30-second ads, 15-second ads you can tell a story, but you can target it way more efficiently. So CTV and OTT is like if you're in data analytics, it's a dream because it works and you can measure it and target it better. What that means is that kind of the 2024, you could also call it the CTV OTT election, where now finally people who are trying to tell these persuasive messages that take a little bit longer time to do have a channel that works well and scales well. And so what I'm going to talk about here, if I just give a little background on what INTRVL is what do we learn from 3 different programs that use heavily CTV and OTT, and what does that mean for data analytics, and what does it mean for media optimization moving forward? First, so INTRVL, we work primarily with organizations on the left running paid media programs, often heavily digital. We help them improve their targeting and media buying strategy with rapid custom modeling. So who should you talk to right before you run a program? And then often by measuring the impact of that program, either with surveys run mid-flight or sometimes even the voter file and early vote data to see what is actually working, to the point Christina brought up about using it measurement to optimize. We specialize in that side of everything. And then, but we also measure over weeks and months, which is different than the creative pre-testing Maeve was talking about with Grow Progress. We're in the muck, in the feeds, we're trying to figure out what does that do cumulatively, and then learn how to improve over that, with that information. So we often calculate ROIs, so the dollar per, or the votes per a specific audience segment or a specific media channel, so that those who are making these decisions can maximize ROI with media dollars better allocated, which includes figuring out efficiency curves sometimes. So just can't keep doing more and more of something that works. Eventually, it stops not working so much. So we're trying to help everybody calibrate the right amount. So anyway, what I'm trying to say here, though, is that with enough data, media impact is predictable. We can understand who's likely to respond just from having seen who's responded before to media. And heterogeneous effects or observable, what I mean by that is like not everybody responds the same. And it's a thing that you can see with enough data. When it comes to paid media, as I mentioned, this was the CTV OTT election, and billions were spent on it for good reasons. So these 3 programs, they were run in swing states. They invested approximately the same amount of money per voter that was targeted. Each ran digital creatives that were pre-tested. So the things they were showing people were supposed to work. Like in the testing environments where you show people the ad, they respond to it, you run the RCTs, these creatives worked well there. So kind of basically setting the stage that they were spent about the same per voter, the creatives were all supposed to work. And let's see here. So, but Program A had a smaller audience and had less study power. What I mean by that is we weren't able to run as many surveys and actually see effects and be really clear about how they varied amongst different groups. B was medium-sized. It also neither A or B were like optimized up front with the best data on who you should speak to. They had a good idea about their audience, but they didn't like rank them most likely to respond to least. And so no upfront optimization. Program C was a larger program. We ran a ton of surveys, so we had a lot of power, meaning we could figure out the small differences between different parts of the audience. And they did optimize their audience at the beginning. We used all this data to decide, don't talk to these folks because multiple signals are telling us, don't do it. They're not likely to respond to media. So what was that predictive data that I'm talking about? One, media responsiveness based off past media impact measurement models, meaning after the midterms in 22, we measured programs. We could take those models and figure out who's likely to respond in 24. We have a branding term for that at INTRVL. We call that max lift. If you know YouTube, they used to do something similar to that too. The other predictive data is just who's currently open. So who's saying right now that like, I'm not sure I'm going to vote for one candidate or another, or if I want to turn out or not. That's the other data. And the fresher it is, the more useful it is. So 2 types of predictive data on who's supposed to respond to a media program or not, based off what we've seen. And so the outcome measure here, let's get to the brass tacks of it all. So this is impact on the proportion of a targeted audience voting for Kamala Harris. So that's actually kind of like a term, mobilizing and persuading. So we're just trying to see how many of these people who were targeted turned out for, it wasn't vote share, Trump versus Kamala Harris. And it wasn't just straight turnout. It was, did you get that outcome? Somebody to vote for Kamala Harris, whether it's getting off the couch or getting off of Trump. That's the thing we're showing here. So let's see. Next thing, this was measured with digital ad surveys, which is a thing some of the terms talked about before, pre-stratification, weighting by response quality. We run these, and it's because it's a digital ad survey, it's digitally native. It does a good job picking up digital media effects. So I'll get through these pretty quickly now. If you haven't figured it out already by looking at these charts for a while, Program A, it wasn't pre-optimized. We estimated a 1 percentage point impact, but it's weak. Like our statistical evidence behind that is kind of maybe. We can't see differences in groups. So it's about the same impact, but really more just because we couldn't tell for sure if one part responded more to another. Program B, so this was a medium-powered one. It wasn't pre-optimized on the audience side, but we had a lot of data at the end. And then we could clearly resolve the folks that we thought would respond more, did respond more, and the folks that we thought would respond less, backlashed a little bit. So now with enough power, we have resolution, and we can see who does respond and who doesn't really clearly. So the strongest evidence is in the bottom right. It's the highest openness and highest prior measurement would suggest that they would respond more. And then Program C, the only one that actually cut the audience off of this predictive data, had a higher impact, so 1.6 percentage point versus 1, but the heterogeneous effects are a little weaker because we've already resolved the folks who aren't supposed to respond to it. We took them out of the audience. So in conclusion, the broadcast threat, CTV, OTT, it definitely works because it's so similar to broadcast and that it's high quality media. And with analytics, it can be very impactful and well targeted. And move forward here. Okay.
All right. So actually, can you go back to your slide
okay.
if you don't mind? because I was staring at the adjective that you put.
Oh, I went all the wrong way. Who could do better than me on this?
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. If you go back to your slide, can I?
Yeah, just take this from me.
Is it not working? Okay, well,
Wasn't me.
Oh, it works. Okay. Yeah, I was stuck with the adjective here, predictable. Because I think often we think of election outcomes to be unpredictable, even though the campaign media effects might be a little bit predictable. So some of you guys already mentioned this already, but I want to ask a more specific question here, which is, what was the most surprising or the most unconventional pattern that you found for yourself from your data that you saw from 2024? Yeah, something that you didn't expect to see or a little bit unusual compared to other previous elections. Because if everything's predictable, then we should,
Well,
go ahead.
I'm just on the side of here. A lot of the assumptions about how people of certain ethnic groups were supposed to respond to media, like Black voters, how they were supposed to respond. A lot of those priors were not true as it played out. Saw multiple measurements where people got it wrong, and I don't think people thought they'd get it right. I think people thought they'd get it right a lot more, and so what was unexpected was how frequently people got it wrong when they were talking to Black voters.
Nice. Chris?
I'll say two things on this front. So one is, and I kind of touched on this when I was sharing our meta-analysis results, we've tested so many different types of programs over the years, so many different iterations of programs, that it gives us a really good baseline as far as what we think, how well we think a program is likely to perform. That being said, and so many panels throughout the day have touched on it, there are big sort of atmospheric shifts happening around voters in the ways that campaigns take place and operate, the ways that people see themselves and their relationships to community, government, politics, all that sort of thing. And so beyond any sort of singular surprising test results, I do think part of what we're all trying to grapple with in the aftermath of 2024 is how some of those big dynamics are challenging our conventional sense of just what works or what does not work moving forward. And for analytics professionals, so many of the models that we do are based on priors, right? And to the extent that those priors no longer hold or don't do so consistently or reliably, it's really challenging our ability to adapt these baseline estimates and sometimes even the ways that we measure things, just again, based on some of these larger shifts. And I'll kind of build on that by saying, the Analyst Institute has been around something like 20 years now. And we have a lot more confidence, and we see some types of programs perform much more consistently than others. But I will say that there are some things that have kind of been bedrock aspects of modern campaigning for a long time, certainly for as long as I've been in this business, that are no longer performing as well as they used to. And a really good example that I'll give you is how much variation that we see in door-to-door canvas programs. I myself did a fair amount of door-to-door canvassing this last cycle. And I have to say that I was really surprised by how many doors I knocked on had Ring cameras. I don't know, maybe other people are tracking this, but it was the first time that I was kind of out canvassing in a long time. And it struck me that everybody's got these cameras and nobody's answering the door anymore. And declining contact rates, door to door or the phone, we've talked about this. People know this. We've all been kind of grappling with it. But that was a really sharp and acute example for me about, again, this has been such a bedrock aspect of campaigning for so long. How are we going to change the ways that we not only think about that mode of contact as part of the set of tools in a campaign toolbox, so we can make kind of cross-program resource allocation decisions effectively? But then, when we go all in on that particular type of outreach, how do we optimize it, including in keeping with some of the ways that life has changed, the world has changed, and voters' interactions with campaigns have changed as well?
So before we hear from Erika, one additional question based on the plot here. So I was very struck by the pattern here. If you look at the distribution of the data points here, that 40% of the estimates that you have are below zero. Meaning that had a backlash effect. So you briefly mentioned that sometimes you try something new or creative. So I'm just curious to hear, what are the things that negatively impacted voter turnout that you've seen from the studies?
Yeah, really good. And I really want to underline this point here that, and this relates to what we were just talking about, but in terms of predictability as well. We at Analyst Institute always coach campaigns and the organizations that we work with to test when the answer is not already knowable. In other words, if you already know what you're going to do, your decision has already been made, there's not a lot of value behind doing the research, and you're going to spend a lot of time and money and energy to otherwise not shift the course of your decision-making or your campaigns. But when you don't know what the right decision is, or when you don't know how best to do it, those are really the optimal opportunities for testing and for analytics to come into play. And so part of what we do at Analyst Institute is to encourage people to lean into those situations where the answer is unknown, and to also kind of lean into new and innovative ways of doing campaigns to keep up with some of these evolutions in the broader context and the way campaigns are operating, trying something new. And then even if it doesn't work the first time, you learn from that testing experience. Maybe you go back and you change something, you test it, and you try it again. And you might see a better effect size. It might give you more direction as far as how to keep iterating, but you kind of keep going from there. And so sometimes people see these smaller negative effect size and they take it as kind of a nail in the coffin for some of these approaches, when really it's just one step along the way to improving program performance. And that's certainly true over cycle after cycle. And as groups become more familiar with sharing those hard-learned lessons with one another.
Could have done something just to that side, because sometimes those negative numbers are just like study power, or in the confidence interval around it would mean it's actually null, and it's more just a result of randomness, like power testing, when you basically decide how much data you need in order to see a result you expect. It's still based off the fact that 20% of the time, like 80% power is like the threshold, you're probably not going to see it. So like we're going to see a lot of negatives or backlash from parents, just because sometimes it's hard to always get the exact right answer. The point is, so it's just a hard thing to deal with sometimes when you're trying to take away from what did it work or not, is when you have to deal with it's just hard to measure sometimes and always see the result.
Yeah, and again, I would just highlight here that we're talking about presidential general elections. So just bear in mind, like, how many people are just naturally inclined to vote anyway without sort of any GOTV outreach from a campaign or organization. It's a lot of people, right? So it kind of raises the bar for any campaign or organization or program to produce an added effect on top of the already high level of turnout. That's different in these other sort of election contexts that are on this graph here, where you actually have a lot more room to change the outcome.
Erika, the most surprising pattern that you saw?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most surprising was probably the balance in TV and the fact that we didn't see a large drop-off. I mean, we've been waiting for the drop-off too. Like, it's coming, right? But it's surprising, I think, in some ways, that we're in 2024 and still seeing so much of it. I guess I would say two other things. One, there was really interesting variation in the campaign themes over time, but Trump, in 75% of his ads, mentioned cost of living. And I think that is really interesting. You had both Trump and Harris, that their combined top two issues, because both candidates had the same top two issues, were taxes and cost of living. And it's just that Trump focused on them more heavily than Harris did. And I guess the last thing, in part because Trump spent so little on Facebook and Instagram, I was especially surprised to see, we were looking at the number of unique creatives, that he had a lot of unique creatives on the Meta platforms. We haven't dug into that yet, so I can't tell you more. I was just super surprised to see that there were so many, given how little he spent relative to Harris.
I see. So as a person who conducted a field experiment during the 2024 election with the social media influencers on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, my question for you is, how should we think about the unpaid advertising? Because a lot of the campaign metrics that we are looking at are paid, but the New York Times, after the election, called it as a TikTok election. The New Yorker said it was an election about parasocial relationships that social media creators built with the voters, and then they somehow leveraged that relationships to persuade them to vote for the one or the other. So from the campaign perspective, that you work with the campaigns, obviously. So I'm curious how they think about this emerging media landscape, that not only the paid advertisement, it's more organic. It's a lot of unpaid social media creators kind of participating in this space. So how do we grapple with that dynamic? I'm personally very curious.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, just because there are some funders who love things that are easy to measure. There are some funders who love things that are just interesting and hot and could potentially be like the way we break through. And so you mentioned doing a field experiment with influencers. It's one of those like something very hard to know who are they actually reaching and what does it actually do.
Exactly.
Like there are direct pathways sometimes when an influencer shares something and he clicks, and then now you've got some information. You can do some more tracking and build things around it. But if it's tens of thousands of followers or millions of followers and you don't get good information about like who's being reached by that content, measurability goes way down. So I think this is a tough problem for anybody who's trying to do analytics in this space is to better understand, does it actually work or does it not? When does it become so people just start scrolling away on the feed and like, not another one of these, this person's not real. But I think that it's known that more folks are getting information online from like TikTok and they'll go there first as like search instead, as long as it's still around. But we'll continue to have these ecosystems. So I think it can work in certain situations. We're still measuring a little bits of it with when we have good pathways, but it is really tough to know whether it's better. It's just something that people are leaning into because it seems like it should work, and anecdotal evidence and some measured studies are showing, but it's still hard to figure out.
I think the fragmentation of the media landscape is an issue, right? There's always been unpaid messaging, right? And so measuring that along with the paid messaging is super important to understanding campaign effects because voters are getting both and they don't necessarily always distinguish, right? And so that's one of the things. But I think the increasing fragmentation of the media landscape and the fact that you have different types of personalization per voter, you can try to model some of that. You can try to, understand the sort of collections of folks who look similar to each other, but it's still really challenging as a measurement problem. I do think that's where the polling that was discussed earlier about what are voters hearing is a way to try to track what is breaking through, because it isn't always the paid messaging, it isn't always the influencers, it isn't always it sounds like for the Harris campaign it was mostly where she was, right? So I think getting some leverage on that may be easier in some ways than to try to actually understand the individual specifics of the message landscape.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd underline the measurement challenges here, especially when we're talking about organic or kind of non-paid, online activity here. I would also add two things. One is I think so much of this sort of influencer conversation tends to focus on really big names, celebrities, kind of what is their role in driving public opinion and voter behavior. That's part of the conversation, but I think we're also really curious about how you can call them micro-influencers or online community leaders. These are individuals with personal followings, but not millions and millions and millions of followers. They can often be very credible messengers, helping break down policy issues or framing the stakes of an election for voters who might not otherwise be engaged here. And then secondly, I think it's important that we think about parasocial relationships and social relationships in both online and offline contexts, right? Obviously, a lot of this is happening online. We've touched on that in different panels throughout the day. But if we want to think about this in terms of just the lacking social fabric, the loneliness epidemic, the erosion of some of these social and cultural groups now, it's harder and harder for people to have real sort of dynamic back and forth conversations with each other about politics and tough issues. And, I was talking about canvassing earlier. It's definitely really hard to do. But when you're actually able to reach somebody in person and have that dynamic back and forth, there are no other modes of contact that actually allow for that. And I think there's something really powerful there that we think of as kind of at the heart of the way political and civic conversations happen and should happen moving forward. So what does that look like in offline contexts as well as online?
So now we have questions from the audience. I have a couple here. One of the questions, I think it's very important as we are thinking about the next election in 2026. So the question was, what is the one recommendation that, in retrospect, that you want to give the Harris campaign that they could have done differently in terms of the campaigning?
Yeah, it's a great question. Listen, I'll start. A big part of what we do at Analyst Institute is after the election cycle, we're analyzing the results of all these tests that we've done across partners, and we're looking at the results of these programs so that we can help people understand what happened, but we can also make forward-looking recommendations. We're at the height of that now. So I'm going to say that there's a lot that we haven't yet kind of sorted out, but will in the coming weeks and months. I also think that as people are thinking about this question and we're grappling with the answers here, that we distinguish, and this is what I was hoping to do from the beginning here, we distinguish assessments of program impacts from the amount of money that was spent and the election outcome. Because going back to Analyst Institute's founding here, part of the sort of human and cultural dynamic that we're meant to kind of push against is this idea that if a campaign is not successful, then however much money it spent or whatever decisions that it made, those were the wrong decisions and that money was wasted. That was the kind of old way of thinking prior to analytics becoming so ingrained in campaigns. But we know that's not the case. We know that because of studies like this, programs can have really important effect sizes, and still, for many reasons, it cannot be enough. So I know that's a little bit of a dodge because there's a lot of information that we're still gathering, but we will be looking at this in terms of program performance and not just election outcome. Yes.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think one thing we haven't said explicitly, but it's worth saying, is that this was a tremendously tough year for any Democratic candidate, right? So to lay the blame at the Harris campaign is almost misplaced in some ways. I think if you look at the places where she was most competitive, it was where the campaign was, which suggests that there were effects. And so I think thinking about that is important. And I don't know in this landscape. I just think it was tremendously difficult. If I had to say one thing, I guess potentially, some further separation from Biden, right? That was maybe the biggest potential issue. But it's hard as a vice president who is, attached to that candidate. I think I think relative to 2016, which is why I do think it's really an interesting look. There weren't any, from my view, obvious mistakes in the campaign. In fact, it seems like it was quite robust and touched a lot of the things that needed to be said. I think that the one overarching issue for Democrats that I think that they should consider, I guess I have two on that front. One is that they've been talking a lot about abortion, and that has sort of been driving the gender side of the campaign. Republicans this last cycle, building off of messaging that they started in 2022, turned on transgender issues to it seems to me, try to take back the gender conversation, because some of the language in those ads especially is about protecting women. Mm-hmm. So I think Democrats should think and grapple with how they respond to those messages, because they didn't really respond to those. And then the other, if you go from sort of gender landscape to racial landscape, the immigration and crime conversations are real and they're happening on both sides, but they are both negative in valence. And I think that is something to think about and grapple with, because I think there are positive cases for immigration to be made, not currently being made, at least in paid advertising. So I think thinking about those sorts of things. But again, I don't know that that's a Harris-specific thing. I think that's a bigger picture thing.
Yeah, this is a tough one too, just because I'm not to read too many points I've just said. The New York Times wrote an article about digital ad targeting and how the Trump campaign did so much better than the Harris campaign. But then after speaking with people who were part of the Harris campaign and digging further, no, we did the right thing. Yes, multiple tactics were done correctly. I think with the Harris campaign, it just was painted a little bit incorrectly by the victors, who were like, we did everything right, they did everything poorly, off of some anecdotes. So I think everything said here, the swing states outperformed than the non-swing states, because all the money on the left was invested there, and the tactics did what they could do. The broader landscape was just not there it seemed like they didn't seem for Kamala Harris to overcome everything else that was going on. So I don't know. I think it's how do you deal with that situation, that context? You can't really wind back the clock, but and then Elon Musk coming in late with so much money. How do you respond to that? Hard to prepare for, but that means it's tough. That's a battle probably weren't prepared to fight with, because you wouldn't have expected that much to come in that late from one person leaning into one or two issues so heavily and being effective at doing so. So I would just say prepare for the big money billionaire coming in later. Try to figure that out later, how to pivot towards that, which can mean upending a lot of things that we're working. So that'd be it.
I see. So other question is kind of related to how we think about campaign effects overall, meaning that most of the time there are two campaign effects happening at the same time, like the Trump campaign and Harris campaign. And when you are working with, for instance, one campaign only, the question was, do you real-time monitor the effects of the campaigns from the other side? Like, to what extent do you think about the net impact of your campaign versus the overall? Yeah.
Well, I think if you're running a randomized control trial, when you're doing measurement, you're going to be getting your net impact outside of all of the noise. So that's a great way to be able to understand what is your program doing. A lot easier with paid media to be that specific, or doors when you can be that specific, mail, text, anywhere where you can run a true RCT. It's easier to be able to tease your net impact versus everything else. Commercial marketing analytics does a lot of media mix modeling, where we'll take competitive spend and put it alongside their own properties. That's a great way to really understand how context affects your program, but it's hard to do unless you have the right data. If you get the TV data and then put it into your measurement programs, you could better resolve context. I mean, broadly speaking, when people are spending a lot of money in a geography or against a given voter segment, it just makes your program less effective because you have to compete more. That's the easiest thing to track, is just people spending a lot of money there against the same people. Yeah, it's probably not going to work as much unless you match that spend. And even then, sometimes the messaging can have like a weird or countering effect or amplifying effect. So, but you need the right data to know what's going on in order to sometimes detangle what your program's doing versus what everything else is doing. Or you need a clear setup, like an experiment, to make that easy.
Yeah, I would add that there's kind of a growing effort to track activity throughout the course of the cycle. It is harder for many of the reasons that have been touched on to actually associate live assessments of impact throughout the cycle as well. Although, there are some new tools and approaches that are making that a little bit easier. It's a challenge, I would say, for analytics folks to take in that volume of data throughout the cycle and use it to sort of inform the real-time decisions that need to be made, while also kind of keeping track of the bigger picture here and not kind of over-indexing on whatever the latest, the content of the latest ad is or whatever, and kind of becoming, I think, too myopic on whatever the latest data point can be. I think there are some approaches that are better at that than others, but it's only kind of recently, and I think really came to a head in 2024, that we've even had the sort of data and tools in place to know that that's an issue and to now work on getting better at that moving forward.
And I think one thing, just to tag on to both of these points, we often make the assumption by aggregating, and I did that at the start of my talk, that assuming that all ads are equal, which they are not. We know that, right? So the volumes and the spending is actually not the picture you want. You want to be able to differentiate by the messaging impact, but that's even harder to do, right? So, and even harder to do that when you're trying to also guide your own strategy.
I see. So the next question, I think this is for Steven and Christina. The operators in paid media, meaning that your salary comes from working with the people who spend money on paid media. Do you feel threatened by the rise of the unearned media, like unpaid advertising, the rise of, for instance, social media creators who are not necessarily being paid? And a lot of things are now more organic, not necessarily all controlled by the campaign. Yeah, that's the question. Do you feel threatened?
Oh, that's an easy no, not at all for me. What's really special about Analyst Institute as an organization, I'll just brag for just a moment here, is that we don't run direct voter contact ourselves, paid, unpaid media, anything else. We don't do that ourselves. We exist kind of a step away from that, and that sort of independence is what allows us to do the kind of research that we've been talking about, but also to be sort of unbeholden, if you will, to any of the actors or small p political dynamics that are happening in the space. And it makes our ability to kind of look across programs, look across studies, and make recommendations in that kind of clear-eyed and unbiased way a really important part of what we do and a really important value add to the ecosystem. So no.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. This is why people trust the Analyst Institute and Analyst Group and what they put out there. And those 0 to 1 percentage point mobilization, and you talk about, INTRVL commonly says just like that is the benchmark for what we see from VoterFile, because it's a trusted institution that has been around. and isn't biased or swayed by the forces of people who might pay for a measurement project. So I think just stepping back from the paid media, INTRVL doesn't get paid either by the digital ad spend itself for the measurement projects. We do audience targeting, and so the audience targeting work that people buy against it, they spend more against that. Sure, we can get a piece that could help us, but like measurement is its own thing, so the paid media. But creators, I think we're still trying to figure out how to measure them too. Like at the end of the day, it's like how to have relationships with voters and get your message across. And whether it's paid media or it's knocking doors or it's working with curators, it's just ways to have conversations and build relations. And we just want to help measure that. So we're just trying. It just requires new tooling and it's harder. And so we're taking advantage of a digital ad survey. Like which can do better for work with creators and follow behavior. That's not threatened, but it's a challenge because it's just hard to do.
So I think this is the last question of the panel. So half of the audience here are either the industry professionals or also students who want to pursue careers in political analytics. So we had a very rough semester at Columbia. So if you have any advice for our students who wants to pursue the career in the industry that you're working in, we'd love to hear from you.
I'm happy to start. For folks who are interested in pursuing careers on the left or with aligned civic engagement organizations, and you're interested in the meta-analysis I shared or any of the other research that we do at Analyst Institute, I'd really invite you to join our network. It's completely free. You can go to analystinstitute.org and click sign up, and that'll get you full membership and full access to everything that we do. It's really helpful in terms of showing the latest sort of state of the research. You can also get a sense of the innovative areas of practice that particular partner groups are pursuing. And it's also a great way to develop your network of folks in the field as well. And I'll just add one final promotion. We have our big conference coming up in July of this year. Think of it as summer camp for people in research analytics. If you want to learn more of what we do, we get together in person. And that'll be our opportunity to dive deeper into what we saw in the 2024 election and how it relates to studies that we've done in past cycles, longer term.
Is it free?
It's completely free.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
Completely free to join.
Yeah, I mean, I would say learn to vibe code. So get really good at AI and how to get you to do complex statistical operations, data engineering operations, all that data cleaning work that was talked about, how painful it is and how much time it is. Gemini 2.5 writes some of the best code I've ever seen. And so learn that, and you will help solve infrastructure problems and measurement problems way faster than folks have been doing this for decades. So I would say lean very heavily into that and learn from those who are experienced and like they're truly the why. There's some things that AI won't get right, but in terms of the implementation, if you're not using that to help you do it, you're going to move so much slower. So figure that out quick.
Okay. So I think that's all we have for this panel today. So thank you all for your compelling insights, and let's give a round of applause to our fantastic panelists.
Thank you.